There are some family photographs that should never have been taken. In a dusty attic in rural Kentucky, tucked behind generations of forgotten memories, lies a wedding album that tells a story so twisted, so fundamentally wrong that even hardened historians have struggled to speak its name aloud. In white lace, the bride is radiant, her smile hopeful and innocent. Proud beside her stands the groom, his hand placed possessively on her waist. They look like any young couple beginning their life together in 1920s America. But a secret is held within this photograph, one that would destroy everything we think we know about the boundaries of human decency. She didn't just marry into the family. She married her own blood, her own brother. And this wasn't some desperate act born of isolation or madness. This was calculated. This was planned. This was a family tradition that had been festering for generations in the shadows of American society, hidden behind respectable facades and Christian values, while something unspeakably dark grew stronger with each passing year. Tonight, we're going to tell you about the Bramwell family of Eastern Kentucky. A bloodline so corrupted by its own design that by the time the truth finally surfaced, it was already too late for the children who paid the ultimate price. This is not just a story about forbidden love or rural isolation. This is about a family that deliberately chose to destroy itself from within, generation after generation, and about the innocent victims who never had a chance to escape the genetic prison their ancestors had built around them. The woman in that wedding photograph was named Sarah Mae Bramwell. The man standing beside her was her brother, Thomas. And what happened after their wedding night would create a legacy of human suffering that continues to haunt the hills of Kentucky to this very day. The Bramwell curse didn't begin with Sarah Mae and Thomas. It began 3 generations earlier in 1847 when Jeremiah Bramwell first settled in the remote hollows of Pike County, Kentucky. Jeremiah wasn't running from the law or seeking fortune in the coal mines. He was running from something far more personal, far more shameful. A different story is told by court records from his previous home in Virginia than the one his descendants would later claim. Jeremiah had been quietly asked to leave his community after allegations surfaced about his relationship with his own sister, Rebecca. But here in the mountains where neighbors lived miles apart and questions weren't asked, Jeremiah could start fresh. He could reinvent himself. And most importantly, he could begin building a family according to his own twisted vision of purity. Jeremiah believed that outside blood weakened the family line. He preached that true strength came from keeping the bloodline concentrated, undiluted by strangers who couldn't understand their ways. It sounds like the rambling of a madman, but Jeremiah was calculating. He was planning something that would span generations. Jeremiah's first act wasn't to find a wife from the local community. It was to send word back to Virginia, calling for his younger sister, Rebecca, to join him. She arrived 6 months later, already carrying his child. The local preacher who married them never asked questions about their shared last name or their identical features. Money changed hands. Documents were altered, and Rebecca Bramwell became Rebecca Matthews in the church records. But in the privacy of their isolated cabin, she remained what she had always been. Jeremiah's sister, his wife, and the unwilling mother of a bloodline that would carry poison in its veins for the next century. Their first child was born in 1848, a son they named Ezekiel. He seemed healthy at birth, but by age 3, the signs were already showing. Ezekiel couldn't speak properly. His left arm was withered, and his eyes held a vacant stare that unnerved even his own parents. But Jeremiah saw no warning in his son's condition. He saw only the beginning of his grand experiment in human breeding. Ezekiel Bramwell grew up believing that his family was blessed, chosen by God to remain pure in an impure world. When he reached manhood in 1870, there was never any question about who he would marry, his younger sister, Charity. She had been promised to him since childhood. It wasn't love that bound them together. It was duty, tradition, and the suffocating weight of their father's obsession with bloodline purity. The wedding was a small affair, attended only by immediate family and a handful of neighbors who had learned not to ask uncomfortable questions about the Bramwells. But behind the celebration, behind the carefully constructed facade of respectability, something horrifying was already taking shape. Charity was pregnant before the wedding, and everyone knew it. What they didn't know was that this pregnancy would produce not one child, but 3 triplets whose birth would reveal the full horror of what the Bramwell bloodline was becoming. The first triplet, a boy named Samuel, appeared normal at birth but never developed the ability to walk. His legs remained twisted and useless, forcing him to crawl across the floor of their cabin like an animal. The second, a girl named Ruth, was born with her heart on the wrong side of her chest, a condition that would kill her before her 5th birthday. But it was the third child, another boy they named Mordecai, who would become the true inheritor of his grandfather's terrible legacy. Mordecai was born with a sharp intelligence that seemed almost unnatural, as if the genetic damage that had destroyed his siblings had somehow concentrated their mental capacity into his developing brain. He could read by age 3, could perform complex mathematical calculations by age 5, and by age 10, he had already begun developing his own theories about what he called genetic perfection through selective breeding. He had taken his grandfather's crude obsessions and transformed them into something that resembled science. Something that sounded almost reasonable when he explained it in his calm, measured voice. But beneath Mordecai's intellectual gifts lurked something far darker. He had inherited more than just his grandfather's beliefs about bloodline purity. He had inherited the family's complete inability to see their own victims as human beings worthy of compassion or choice. By 1895, Mordecai Bramwell had become the undisputed patriarch of the family, and he ruled his bloodline like a twisted scientist conducting an experiment on human genetics. He had married his own sister, as tradition demanded. But Mordecai's ambitions went far beyond simple sibling marriage. He began keeping detailed records of every birth, every death, every genetic anomaly that appeared in the family tree. He catalogued the children who died in infancy, the ones who survived with severe disabilities, and the rare few who seemed to inherit what he called concentrated family gifts. Mordecai's wife's sister, Temperance, bore him 7 children over 12 years. 3 died before their 1st birthday, their tiny bodies unable to cope with the genetic damage that ran through their blood. 2 more survived but lived their entire lives as invalids, unable to care for themselves, completely dependent on family members who saw them not as beloved children but as failed experiments. But it was the surviving children, Thomas and Sarah Mae, who would become the culmination of Mordecai's life work. Thomas was born in 1896, physically strong but emotionally hollow, as if the genetic concentration had burned away his capacity for normal human feeling. Sarah Mae followed 2 years later, beautiful in an otherworldly way that seemed to mesmerize everyone who met her. But beneath her ethereal appearance lay a mind that had never been allowed to develop its own thoughts, its own desires, its own sense of self-preservation. From birth, she had been told that her purpose was to marry Thomas, to bear his children, and to continue the family's march toward what Mordecai called genetic transcendence. But Mordecai wasn't content to simply arrange another sibling marriage. He had spent decades studying the family's breeding patterns, and he believed he had discovered something extraordinary. The children born from the most closely related parents, the ones who survived the genetic lottery, seemed to possess unusual abilities. Some showed extraordinary memory. Others demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to predict weather patterns or animal behavior. Mordecai convinced himself that his family was evolving into something beyond ordinary humanity, and Thomas and Sarah Mae represented the next crucial step in that evolution. What Mordecai refused to acknowledge, what he couldn't allow himself to see, was the human cost of his experiment. For every child with unusual gifts, 10 others had died in agony. For every generation that seemed to prove his theories, dozens of lives had been sacrificed on the altar of his scientific hubris. The spring of 1921 brought unseasonable warmth to the Kentucky mountains, and with it came the wedding that would represent the dark culmination of 74 years of deliberate genetic destruction. Sarah Mae Bramwell had turned 23 that March, and her brother Thomas was 25. They had never known a world where they were not destined for each other, never experienced the freedom to love someone outside their own blood, never even imagined that what their family demanded of them was profoundly wrong. Sarah Mae spent her wedding morning in the same bedroom where she had slept as a child, having her hair arranged by female cousins who whispered excitedly about the ceremony as if it were completely normal. She wore her grandmother Temperance's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, and carried a bouquet of mountain laurel picked from the same hillside where 3 generations of Bramwell brides had gathered their wedding flowers. To anyone watching from the outside, she looked like any nervous bride preparing for the most important day of her life. But there were no outsiders watching. The wedding guest list included only immediate family members, and even they numbered fewer than 20 people. Too many children had died young. Too many adults had lived abbreviated lives marked by illness and disability. The Bramwell bloodline was collapsing under the weight of its own genetic damage. But Mordecai saw only the approaching fulfillment of his life's work. Thomas waited at the makeshift altar in the family's main room, wearing a suit that had belonged to his father, his hands steady but his eyes empty of any emotion that could be called joy or love. He understood his role in the family's grand design, had been prepared for this moment since childhood, but something essential had been carved out of his soul during those years of preparation. He looked at Sarah Mae, not as a beloved sister or a desired bride, but as a carefully selected breeding partner in an ongoing experiment. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Could you have broken the cycle, or would the weight of generations have crushed your resistance, too? The ceremony itself lasted less than 10 minutes. A local preacher, paid generously for his silence, spoke the traditional words while carefully avoiding any mention of the bride and groom's relationship. Documents were signed, photographs were taken, and Sarah Mae Bramwell became Sarah Mae Bramwell, keeping the same name she had carried since birth because she was marrying into her own family. Sarah Mae's first pregnancy came within months of the wedding, and Mordecai watched her condition with the intense scrutiny of a scientist monitoring his most important experiment. He kept detailed notes about her symptoms, her cravings, even her dreams. Convinced that this child would represent the pinnacle of the family's genetic concentration, he had calculated the bloodline coefficients, studied the family's breeding patterns, and determined that this baby would carry the highest degree of Bramwell genetic material ever achieved. But when the child was born in early 1922, even Mordecai's scientific detachment couldn't shield him from the horror of what his life's work had produced. The baby, a boy they named Josiah, entered the world with severe spina bifida, his spine completely exposed and his nervous system so damaged that he would never be able to control his own bodily functions. His skull was misshapen, his eyes clouded with cataracts, and his breathing so labored that everyone in the room knew he was dying from the moment he drew his first breath. Josiah lived for 6 agonizing weeks, each day a testament to the cruelty of what the Bramwell family had done to themselves. Sarah Mae sat beside his makeshift crib day and night, singing lullabies to a child who would never hear them, holding tiny hands that would never hold anything back. She had been raised to believe that bearing children was her sacred duty. But watching her firstborn suffer and die awakened something in her that had been buried under decades of family conditioning. For the first time in her life, Sarah Mae began to question the family's beliefs. She began to wonder if their tradition of purity was actually a curse, if their genetic concentration had transformed them into something monstrous. But her doubts came too late. She was already pregnant again, carrying another child whose genetic heritage guaranteed a life of suffering. Thomas responded to their son's death with cold acceptance, as if the baby's agony had been an acceptable price to pay for advancing the family's breeding experiment. He spoke of Josiah as genetic information, as data that would help them refine their approach for future children. When Sarah Mae recoiled from his scientific detachment, when she begged him to consider that they were creating lives destined for torment, he reminded her that questioning the family's ways was a betrayal of everything their ancestors had sacrificed to achieve. The second child, born in late 1922, lived only 3 days. The third, born the following year, survived for 2 months before succumbing to seizures that racked his tiny body with increasing frequency until his heart finally stopped. By 1924, Sarah Mae had given birth to 4 children, and she had buried all of them. The end of the Bramwell bloodline came not with violence or dramatic confrontation, but with the quiet desperation of a woman who had finally seen too much suffering. In the winter of 1925, Sarah Mae made a decision that would have been unthinkable to any previous generation of Bramwell women. She refused to have any more children. She refused to continue the family's genetic experiment. And most shocking of all, she began talking to outsiders about what had been happening in the isolated Bramwell compound for nearly 80 years. Dr. Marcus Webb, a physician from the county seat who had been treating some of the family's surviving children, was the first outsider to fully understand the scope of what the Bramwells had done to themselves. Sarah Mae's testimony, delivered in broken whispers during what she believed might be her final confession, revealed a family history that read like a catalogue of genetic horrors. Deliberate inbreeding across 4 generations had created a bloodline so damaged that normal human reproduction had become virtually impossible. But the true horror wasn't just in the numbers, the dozens of infant deaths, the children who survived only to live lives of unimaginable suffering, the adults whose minds and bodies had been twisted by genetic damage. The true horror was in the deliberate nature of it all. This wasn't the result of isolation or ignorance. This was the calculated destruction of human lives in service of a twisted ideology that had convinced an entire family that their suffering was noble, that their genetic damage was actually evolution, and that their victims were acceptable casualties in a grand experiment. Thomas Bramwell died in 1926, found dead in the barn where he had spent his final months in increasing isolation. His body was ravaged by the same genetic conditions that had killed so many of his relatives. Mordecai followed 2 years later, taking with him the detailed breeding records that had guided the family's destruction for 3 decades. Sarah Mae lived until 1934, but she never had another child, never remarried, and spent her remaining years trying to warn other isolated families about the true cost of genetic isolation. The Bramwell property was eventually sold for unpaid taxes. The buildings were left to decay in the Kentucky mountains, where they had housed for generations of deliberate human suffering. Local historians have tried to bury the story, to pretend that families like the Bramwells were simply victims of circumstance rather than architects of their own genetic destruction. But the truth remains. Carved into cemetery stones that bear the same last names repeated generation after generation is a monument to the darkest possibilities of human choice. Today, genetic counselors use the Bramwell case as a teaching tool, a reminder of what happens when ideology overrides basic human decency. The family story serves as proof that the most horrifying monsters are often the ones who convince themselves that their cruelty serves a higher purpose, that their victims' suffering is justified by their own twisted vision of perfection. The Bramwells didn't just destroy themselves. They destroyed the innocent children who never chose to be part of their experiment, who paid the ultimate price for their ancestors' descent into genetic madness.